With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Jim.
Thank you. Let me see if technology will be with me tonight. It works. Now let's make sure it stays working. Okay. Now the other piece of technology is my clicker. And that seems to be working. Okay, so let me get my notes out. I'm Jim Koch, and I am the secretary of the Thousand Islands chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. Tonight, I'm going to give a brief presentation on an aspect of the revolution that very few people pay attention to or know about: the treatment of prisoners. And there's going to be some surprising facts that will come out of this for you. But thank you for having me this evening. And as we approach the 250th, I think it's important to remember the struggles that led to our independence. The treatment of the prisoners is very much overlooked. So today we'll shed a bit of light on that. And it's on.
If you need me to forward the slides, I can.
Okay, we're gonna do it this way. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Okay, this is the agenda that I'll go into tonight. It's a historic overview of how prisoners were treated, just so that you get a feel for what was done in the past. The treatment of British prisoners by the Continental Army and the militia. How the British treated colonial prisoners. Talking about the losses, and then a little bit of further inquiry if you want to dig into this. Okay, current practice. I don't think there's a person here that doesn't know the words name, rank, and serial number. That's what a captured soldier was required to give during World War II. In 1949, there was an additional amendment to the Geneva Convention, and that added date of birth to that. Okay, so it's name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Prior to that, though, we were dealing with really a history that went back to about 1864. And it was the Hague Conventions that dealt with how to deal with the sick and the wounded, not prisoners. So you dealt with the Hague Conventions, which also came into the Geneva Convention, and these were trying to deal in a humane way with people that were left on the battlefield who were wounded and sick. World War I came about, and they didn't have guides on what to do with prisoners. So you were left at the mercy of the government that took you captive. They used the Geneva and Hague Conventions as guidelines, though. So for the most part, soldiers were treated pretty humanely if it was the British or the Germans or the Americans that took you prisoner. If the Turks took you prisoner, or the Russians took you prisoner, you were on your own, kiddo. So in 1929, a Geneva Convention was put together that gave us the one that we went into World War II. It's monitored by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was founded in the 1860s in Geneva, Switzerland, to monitor how to treat the sick and the wounded. But what the convention really addresses is evacuation from the battlefield. How do you get people off the battlefield when they've been captured or they're wounded? The internment conditions, food, medical, religious needs, safety. One of the things you don't do is you don't take away protective equipment from a captured soldier. They get to keep their helmets and they get to keep protective masks, so that if they were to be gassed or they were to be shelled, they at least had some protection. You can take their weapons. And then there's a respect for rank and the chain of command. There's also permitted work. You cannot do work in support of the war effort if you are of the enemy's war effort. This was routinely violated by the Germans during World War II. And then repatriation. One of the things that they found really, really interesting was here at Fort Drum, soldiers wanted to stay. The Geneva Convention said, you gotta go home. They had nothing to go home to, but to meet the Geneva Convention, they had to go home. So that's current practice, that's where we stand today. Historic precedent's a lot more interesting though. For the majority of history, recorded history, prisoners were treated based on the culture of the capital. Ancient practices, enslavement, taking prisoners to become slaves. Oh, we want to make sure that they don't rebel, take half of them out and kill them. Crucify them. The Romans did that. They lined the roads with the dead so that they knew this is what's going to happen to you if you rebel. Some were just slaughtered. Some were traded as a ransom. I want something from you, we'll give you back some of your people. Think about religious conversion, think about the Crusades. European soldiers who were fighting for the Pope, who were captured by the Muslim, were given a choice, convert or die. So they would do that. Once they converted, they were freed. That wars sometimes were fought solely to gather prisoners. And in the post-Middle Ages, this whole thing of culture shifted to the state. Governments were fighting, so the state was setting up rules. And this is where, as you get into the 1800s, the Geneva Conventions the Geneva and Hague Conventions came to play. One of the things that was evolved in the 1600s was what was called the right of parole. A captured soldier could expect to be treated humanely and then given parole. As you were a prisoner, what that meant was you would be given a parole that you would sign, and you would be sent back to your commander with it that says, I'm no longer a combatant, send me home. I promise not to fight. If they got caught after they had done this and records were kept, they were subject to immediate execution. And that right of parole carried on right up through our Civil War. An example, July 3rd, 1863, Grant takes Vicksburg. He takes several thousand Confederate soldiers prisoner. He paroled them all. He got in a lot of trouble for doing that. And then he said to them, look, you want to have to put them in a prison camp where you have to feed them? Send them home. Let them be a burden on their own society. We'll drain them that way. So that was one of the ways that the right of parole was used and some of the logic behind it. In colonial days, prior to the revolution, we had numerous conflicts with indigenous tribes, numerous conflicts. And it went from being treated humanely to being downright hostile. And in some cases in the revolution, and in one particular case, which my wife will get into, the one prisoner that was taken was literally skinned alive, and then his entrails were trained out, nailed to a tree, and he was told to run around the tree. Okay? So we talk about some of the worst things you could possibly do to a human being. That man was named Petty, and he was captured at a mill where my wife's sixth great grandfather was also captured. So we saw treatment like this, and I'll talk a little bit about it when I talk about the Battle of Saratoga. But this is where we ended up. There was a reasonable expectation for some level of humane treatment. That would face a harsh reality, especially when dealing with the Hessians. They thought nothing of giving a captive the bayonet. They thought nothing of doing that. So this is where we are. Now, in 1775, Washington gave a general order to the Army, ordering humane treatment. He directed that harsh punishment for any Continental soldiers that violated this. He wanted them treated humanely. He didn't want to be seen as the colonists, the traitors, were seen as being brutal. This was in contrast to the orders from King George that the colonial rebels were traitors and were to be hung. Now, the fact is the military disregarded that order. They said, we're not going to do that. God knows what they'll do to us if we start doing that. So General Howe, who was in command of the forces here, said, you will not execute the prisoners. So this was the setup in 1775. By the time the Battle of Saratoga had gotten around, some things had happened. And I'm going to do it a little bit out of order because the battle I'm going to show you was early 1777. This is in September and October of 1777. The Battle of Saratoga was a unique battle. General Burgoyne was in Canada, and he had a plan, which was really a three-part plan, because the hotbed of the Revolution was in New England. It was Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. That's where it really was. New York was kind of wavering. So the idea that Burgoyne was, I'll come down Lake Champlain, take Ticonderoga. General Howe, you come up the Hudson River with your forces, and I'll send one of my forces around from the west, and we'll clean up the Mohawk Valley and have them come across. And we're all going to meet in Albany and have a grand party, because we will cut the people off. And that was the plan. But no military plan survives the first shot, ever. General St. Ledger, or his name was Barry St. Ledger, he was the first one to engage. And he engaged the forces at Fort Stanwix, which is now in Rome. It was Fort Schuyler at the time. The interesting piece was he had both Seneca and Mohawk natives with him. On the colonist side were Oneidas. These were all part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and this was the first time they would meet each other in battle. They'd been at peace with each other. So what happens is he starts a siege of Fort Stanwix to take it. And he's sending another force forward because he's heard General Herkimer's coming with the militia. And this force under Colonel Johnson sets up a trap, a perfect trap. The guys have to come down into a ravine. He's got a blocking force on the one end with native tribes on the other. Unfortunately, the natives pulled the triggers a little too soon. So that allowed a lot of the Americans to escape out. And that was the Battle of Oriskany, where General Herkimer was shot in the leg, his horse got shot out from underneath him, and he sat up against a tree smoking a pipe and giving orders on what to do. He would not leave, he would not retreat. He was expecting to hear a relief column was coming in. And thankfully there was a rainstorm that slowed things down, and then after that, they met again. But it was a defeat for the Americans. But some of the forces left Fort Stanwix, so that the forces there were, the colonial forces were able to get out, and they raided the Indian villages. and they destroyed the Indian villages. When the natives, when the Seneca and Mohawks heard that this happened to their villages, they quit. So this left the British with no allies. So the British withdrew. So leg one, coming in and cleaning up the Mohawk Valley, stops on the 6th of August. Leg two, early part of July, General Howe decides he's going to take Philadelphia. And they all get on boats and sail out of New York City. He leaves a small force under General Clinton there. So Clinton is undermanned when he's coming up the Hudson. By the time this happens at Saratoga, and the big battles happen there, it's too late because they could only get as far north as Kingston. So that's as far north. So there was no help coming from them. So General Burgoyne's coming down and he walks into a perfect trap. And he's outnumbered 3-1. So he starts to negotiate. Okay, I gotta surrender, what am I gonna do now? And his people are sitting there saying, well, demand that they allow us to go back to Canada. That lasted for about 30 seconds because the Americans said no way. They demanded parole. And what happened was they paroled the people and it became known as the Saratoga Convention. So there was a written document, and these forces, I've gotten ahead of myself here, but these forces were all marched off to Boston, where they lived in the same places that they'd occupied when they were in the occupying force in Boston. Because most of these guys had evacuated in 1775, went up to Nova Scotia, came back down to St. Lawrence, and that's how they came back into the battle. Burgoyne lost about 1,000 men in battle. He was outnumbered 3-1, as I mentioned. He didn't have supplies. He lost most of his key leaders. One of the heroes was a gentleman named Benedict Arnold, who was a hero for us. So the Convention of Saratoga was drawn up, and the army, about 6,600 strong, was nicknamed the Convention Army as they were marched off to Boston. They arrived in Boston in November of 1777. I want you to think about the walk from Saratoga to Boston. Okay? He had a lot of leakage along the way, too. Some of these guys said, I'm done with this. And they went out into the country and actually blended in. Same thing happened in Boston. A lot of them, quite frankly, some of them married the local girls. They just said, that's it, I'm done with this war. And they became Americans very quickly. That's about 1,300 of them over this period of time escaped. The unfortunate part of it was what I'm going to tell you next. The Continental Congress revoked the treaty. So these folks were never sent back to Britain as they were supposed to be. They were awaiting boats. And Washington told the folks there, said, drag your feet, don't do this too fast. Something's amiss. And the Continental Congress said, we're revoking this convention. Now the delay, again, what King George declared the fight to be, they're traitors. The British forces did not subject prisoners to the death or to trial because they were hoping to solve the problem peaceably. They were hoping to bring an end to this. But in the meanwhile, they didn't treat prisoners very well, and American prisoners were dying, and I'll get to that. So that Continental Congress took the harder stance because of that. Ultimately, they were marched If you think the march from Saratoga to Boston was long, try taking them from Boston to Charlottesville, Virginia. That was a 3-month march because they wanted to get them out of the New England area and put them into an area that was not subjected to combat. The British families were required to provide for their support. So they sent money over. The locals in Virginia loved it because it was the first hard currency they were getting. They were getting the British pound sterling to support these prisoners. So they thought this was a great deal. And it was highway robbery. They made the most out of this. By 1780, those same prisoners were moved to Frederick, Maryland until the end of the war. And about half of them opted to stay in the United States or just deserted. So that's what happened there. This is a British lithograph from 1860, and what it shows is a high wall compound with little huts. It's a British, it was done in London. They want to show how well the American captives were living and how poorly the prisoners were living. In fact, the prisoners reported being allowed just to go out in the woods and make lean-tos and live there. Go ahead, come in, cook your meal, you can go live in the shelter out there, you're not going anywhere. So, but this, again, was how the Convention Army was used to being treated. The next battle I want to talk about happens about 6 months earlier. It's absolutely inconsequential to the war, but it illustrates something that I want to bring up. Unequal forces. A full battalion of British soldiers comes up on about a company of American militia. Caught them by surprise. If you think about what was happening in 1776 on Christmas Day and a couple of days afterwards, prior to that, Washington was getting his butt kicked. He got booted out of Manhattan, he got booted out of Yonkers, he got booted out of New Jersey, he was in Pennsylvania. And he decided, hey, the whole army is going to go home on me out there because their enlistment expires on December 31st. I've got to do something. So they cross the Delaware and they catch the Hessians off guard. And they quickly do them. So the Brits in Princeton send a force. They get clipped. So there's 2 major victories before the end of 1776. General Howe is sitting in New York thinking about these rabble-rousers and how can this ragtag army beat the professional army? How can they do this? What's been going on that's in the wake of those losses? Our friend General Howe decides he's got to do something punitive. And the folks in Monmouth, New Jersey, and Monmouth County by Sandy Hook, I'll show you a map here shortly, was split about 50% Royalist and 50% Patriot. There was no neutral. You were one or the other. And what was happening was the Loyalists were getting out in boats and raiding supply ships. And this all came about to stop those raids. So we got to stop this noise. So if you look at this map, just to familiarize you with it, if you're not familiar with it, this is Staten Island. Okay, this is Bayonne, Jersey City, New Jersey, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. Large force on Staten Island. And this down here, the Navesink Islands, this is Sandy Hook. It's in the middle of February, and the British control up here. They launch from just up here, just around the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, on the 13th of February, and sail down to this area here. They beach the boats, they jump off the boats into the water, and they wade ashore. They're wearing woolen uniforms, getting into the water in the middle of February. I want you to think about that for a minute. Okay, so these are some tough guys. They climb up the hills, because this is a set of hills, and they catch the Americans asleep up there. The Americans are completely caught naked, and they throw a few shots, some shots are traded, but the reality is they couldn't stand up to it. Hold on, let me get the actual numbers here. It was one particular ship that was grounded in a storm that started all of this, because they freed a French captain who'd been in prison. And we were trying to help the French along in our cause. So the Loyalists report to General Howe, this place is ripe for the taking. Howe decides to end this whole party, and he assembles the assault force. The assault force has to wait 4 days for the weather to clear. He can't get that short distance from Staten Island to Sandy Hook because the weather's so bad. I'm sorry, 3 days. And as I already covered, 25 militia were killed, 72 were taken prisoner. Then they stayed there for another week. But what they did was they sent all the prisoners back to New York City, Manhattan. And what they do with the prisoners? These prisoners had 2 captains, 4 lieutenants. Many of them had their oath of allegiance to the crown in their pocket when they were taken prisoner. That was one way of getting people to, I'll sign the oath, no problem. Because what happened in New York City is if you didn't sign the oath of allegiance, you were in prison. If you were on Manhattan and you didn't sign that oath, you were going to be in prison, period, until you did. They were then taken to what was called the sugar house. Now you have to wonder, why would they put them in a sugar house? What is a sugar house? If you think about your grocery store today, you can buy yourself a 5-pound, whoops, 4-pound bag of sugar, shrinkflation, and it's right there for you. But in colonial times, that was a valuable commodity. It was kept in a prison. It was kept behind bars. It was so valuable. So they took the sugar out and they put the prisoners into the sugar house. This is what the sugar house looked like, and I've found an actual photograph from before they tore it down. The problem is there were about 4 sugar houses on Manhattan, and they're not sure if this was the one that was used, but this is the one that legend has it was used, and I'll use that, legend has it. They were imprisoned in the sugar house. More and more and more are in prison. The conditions were exceptionally harsh. There was no food. Washington tried to get a quartermaster general to get food in, and they had agreed to accept it. But he couldn't get enough food to feed his own army, let alone those that were captured. So people were dying. Food was scarce. Family members provided it. The treatment by the guards was brutal, and overcrowding required some solutions. What are you going to do with all this? You don't have all this room in the sugar house, so what do you do with it? One solution was to use ships. They decommissioned man of war. They took the masts off of them, and then they had multiple desks down below. They closed the gun ports, sally ports on them, and they just simply put the prisoners on board ships. Over time, 16 of these hulks were floated in the East River. Conditions were absolutely appalling. This is what the people that were captured in Navesink arrived to. So they ended up in the sugar house and then moved on board ships. When they died, they were either thrown overboard or just covered with mud on the bank of the East River. That was what happened to the bodies. So there was no ceremony, they were just simply disposed of. Imagine living elbow to elbow and never being able to get up on deck and not having any sanitary facilities. It was horrible. Guards were there, and they thought nothing of sticking you if you got out of line. And they were simply dying below decks. Mass death. And when I say mass death, there were about 4,800 combat casualties during the American Revolution on the colonial side. There were some estimates range between 11,000 and 16,000 that died in these prison ships. So you're dealing with 3 to 4 times the number of people dead at prisons than died in combat. Okay, years later, erosion begins to expose these graves. Skulls start showing up. They begin to collect these in crypts. They know who they are, they know what they're from, they don't know who they are. And it gets to the point that they say, what can we do? So there was a committee put together to build a common trip in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, where it was dedicated in 1908. The Fort Greene chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution was part of that committee, and it's a memorial to the 11,500 or so souls that died on the prison ships. Just to give you an idea. By the way, this was Charleston Harbor also had its share of prison ships. Now this is a little bit about the sugar house. This is what the sugar house actually looked like. That's a picture from the 1860s. In 1892, they're getting ready to put up a new building, the Rhinelander building. It's going to be demolished. Knowing that these were used for prisons, one of the architects says, we need to preserve some of it. So what they did was they took one of the windows with the bars in it, and they embedded it right there in the Rhinelander building. So they sat there and built the building around it as a way in 1892 of remembering what had happened 100 years earlier. But that story doesn't end. Because in 1968, the Rhinelander building is going to go under the wrecking ball to make place for one police plaza, one PP. Anytime you watch, Blue Bloods or any of those, there is one PP. Okay? What they did, they saved that window again. And it's in a pedestrian walkway on the grounds. And there's a plaque to it that talks about the sugar house, what it was there for, and nobody can prove a word that's right on that plaque. Just to let you know, once again, there's doubt as to which sugar house was actually used as the holding pen. But you can see that's one PP in the background, and they built this memorial to it. And that's it face on. So they did attempt, that's part of the history of New York. Now some final notes. I said 72 were captured. 2 of those were my 6th great-grandfathers, Private Joseph Davis and Corporal Obadiah Stillwell. One dies on the 13th of April and the other one on the 11th of March in prison. So they both went down, and my patriot is Obadiah Stillwell. I know that Davis is also a patriot. They had children. Now imagine being raised listening to these stories about what your fathers did. While it's a tragic tale, I'm not sure that their children would have married and become my fifth great-grandparents had they not shared that common tragedy. So I'm here, I like to think, because of that. So I honor it, and I try to spell it out. But those two died in prison. They had 8 children, and I know that they honored their fathers because they named the boys Obadiah and Joseph. I know they honored their fathers. So some of the resources I used, obviously digging a lot of this up in Anthem. County historic societies, Monmouth County was a wealth of information. There are newspaper reports. You got to take every one that I read, though, with a grain of salt, because they were all written in New York newspapers, which were Tory newspapers. But you've got to take everything with a grain of salt. The National Archives continues to add things, but it's still being digitized. There's a lot there for them to digitize. So, you keep looking, you find a little more.